Through the Desert by Henryk Sienkiewicz. If you want more content like this, leave a subscription. Chapter 23. At last the sun rose and lighted up the jungle, the scattered groves, and the forest. The lions disappeared with the first ray of dawn. Staś made Kali build a fire and ordered Mia to take Nell's things out of the leather bag in which they were packed, to dry them and change the girl's clothes as quickly as possible. He took the rifle and carefully went over the camp to see what ravages had been made by the storm and the bloodthirsty beasts. Just behind the hedge, only the stakes of which remained, lay the first horse, nearly half devoured. Some 100 feet further, a second, hardly begun, and next to it the third, with its stomach torn open and its head smashed in. They all presented a terrible sight, for in their open, glassy eyes could be seen their terror at approaching death, and their wide-open jaws displayed their strong teeth. The ground was stamped down, and the cavities formed pools of blood. Staś was so enraged that at the moment he almost wished that the disheveled head of one of the nocturnal robbers, tired out after the feast, would appear behind one of the bushes, so that he might send a bullet through it. But he was obliged to postpone his revenge at present, for he had other things to attend to. The remaining horses had to be caught. The boy supposed that, like Saba, whose carcass was nowhere to be seen, they might have hidden somewhere in the woods. The hope that the faithful fellow-sufferer had not fallen a prey to the wild animals made Staś feel so happy that he took courage once more, and the finding of the donkey naturally increased his joy. It so happened that clever Longears had not even taken the trouble to run far away. He had simply crept into a nook made by the ant-hill and the large tree outside the hedge, and there, with head and sides protected, he had awaited events, in readiness at any moment to repulse the attack by vigorously kicking out his hind legs. But the lions had apparently not noticed him, so when the sun rose and the danger was over, he felt the necessity of lying down and taking a good rest after all the tragical events of the night. While circling the camp, Staś at last found the impress of horses' hoofs in the moistened earth. The tracks pointed toward the woods, and then turned off toward the gorge. That was fortunate, for it would not be difficult to capture horses in the narrow pass. A little further on in the grass was found a foot chain, which one of the horses had succeeded in breaking off during its flight. This horse must have run away so far that for the present he would have to be considered lost. To offset this, Staś discovered the other two behind a low rock, not in the ravine but on its borders. One of them was rolling on the ground, the other grazing in the fresh green grass. Both looked very tired, as though they had run a long distance. But daylight had driven all fear from their hearts, and they greeted Staś by neighing in a short, friendly way. The horse which was rolling on the ground sprang to his feet, which enabled the boy to see that he also had succeeded in breaking loose from his foot chains. But fortunately, he had preferred remaining with his friend to running away aimlessly. Staś left both of them under the cliff and advanced to the edge of the ravine to make sure whether it were possible to continue the journey. He now saw that the heavy downpour had been so severe that the rain had run off and the ground was nearly dry. And soon his attention was attracted by a grayish-white article which had been caught in the vines overhanging the opposite side of the cliff. This proved to be the roof of the tent, which had been blown off and caught on the bushes. It had taken such a strong hold that the rain could not wash it away. After all, the tent offered a better shelter for Nell than the hut made of branches of trees put together hastily, and Staś was much pleased at finding this article, which he had thought was lost. Now his joy increased when out of a higher crevice in the cliff hidden by lianas, Saba came running toward him, holding in his teeth an animal whose head and tail hung out of either side of his jaws. The huge dog climbed down in a minute and laid at Staś's feet a striped hyena, with broken back and one foot bitten off. Then he began to wag his tail and to bark cheerfully as if to say, "I must acknowledge that I took to my heels before the lion, but even you crouched like birds on the tree. And besides, you see, I have not passed the night without accomplishing something." And he was so proud of himself that Staś scarcely liked to make him leave the ill-smelling carcass behind, instead of bringing it to Nell. When they both returned, they found a large fire in the bivouac, water boiling in the pots, and the meal being cooked. Nell had put on dry clothing, but she looked so pale and ill that Staś was startled and took her hand to make sure whether or not she was feverish. "Nell, what is the matter?" asked he. "Nothing, Staś. I am only very sleepy." "I believe it after such a night. Thank goodness you have cold hands. Oh, what a night that was. Of course you must be sleepy. I am sleepy too. But don't you feel well?" "I have a slight headache." Staś laid his hand on her forehead. The little head was cold like the hands, but that was a sign of unusual exhaustion and weakness, and so the boy sighed and said, "You must now have something hot to eat, and then you must lie down and sleep until evening. At least the weather is good today, and not likely to be as it was yesterday." But Nell gazed at him with terror. "We surely are not going to spend the night here?" "Not here, for the mangled horses are lying nearby. We will look for some other tree, or else ride down into the gorge and build a better fence than any in the world. You will sleep as quietly as at Port Said." But she folded her tiny hands and with tears in her eyes besought him to ride on at once, for she said that in this awful place it would be impossible for her to close her eyes, and she would surely get sick. She begged so earnestly, and as she looked into his eyes repeated over and over again, "Staś, please," that at last he consented to do as she wished. "Then we will attempt to continue our journey through the gorge," said he, "for there it is shady. Only promise to tell me when your strength gives out or when you feel weak." "It will not come to that. You can bind me to the saddle, and I shall have a good sleep." "No, I shall ride on the same horse with you. Kali and Mia will ride on the others, and the donkey will carry the tent and the luggage." "Good, good. But as soon as breakfast is over, you must take a little nap. Besides, we cannot start before noon, as there are many things to be done. The horses must be caught, the tent folded, and the baggage repacked. We shall have to leave some things behind, for we have only 2 horses left. It will take a few hours to do all these things, and in the meantime, you will have a good sleep and feel stronger. It is going to be a very warm day, but under the tree it will be shady. And you, and Mia, and Kali? I am so ashamed to be the only one to sleep while you all have so much anxiety. Never mind, after a while we can sleep. Don't be worried on my account. When in Port Said, I frequently, during my examinations, passed entire nights without sleep, but of course my father did not know it. My friends took no rest either. But what a man can stand is of course out of the question for a little fly like you. You have no idea how badly you look today, as frail as glass. Your eyes and hair are all that remain, and there is nothing left of your face." Although he said this jokingly, in his heart he was frightened, for in broad daylight Nell really looked ill, and for the first time it occurred to him that the poor child, if she continued to look like this, not only might die, but was sure to die. At this thought his knees trembled, for he suddenly felt that in case of her death he would have no reason to live or to return to Port Said. "For what would there be in life for me?" he continually thought. He turned away for a minute, so that Nell should not see the look of sadness and fear in his eyes, and then he went to the baggage, which was piled up under the tree, took off the cloth which covered the cartridge case, opened it, and began to search for something. It was there, in a little glass phial, that he kept the last quinine powder and guarded it as the apple of his eye for a dark hour, that is, in case Nell should take the fever. But now it was almost certain that after such a night the first attack would come on, and so he decided to take precautions against it. This he did with a heavy heart, thinking of what might follow, and if he had not felt the impropriety of a man and leader of a caravan weeping, he would surely have dissolved into tears on parting with his last powder. In order to hide his emotion, he assumed a stern look, turned to the girl, and said, "Nell, I want you to take the rest of the quinine before you eat." "And if you get the fever?" she asked. "Then I will shake myself. Take it, I say." She took it without further resistance, for since he had shot the Sudanese she was a little afraid of him, notwithstanding the attention and kindness he showed her. Then they all sat down to breakfast, and after the toils of the night thoroughly enjoyed a plate of good soup. Nell fell asleep as soon as the meal was finished, and slept some hours. Meanwhile, Staś, Kali, and Mia prepared the caravan for the journey, brought the top part of the tent from the ravine, saddled the horses, put the pack on the donkey, and hid under the roots of shrubs everything they were unable to take with them. They were almost overcome with sleep while performing these duties, so Staś arranged that they should take turns in having a short nap, fearing that otherwise they might go to sleep during the journey. It was about 2 o'clock when they set out again. Staś held Nell in front of him on the saddle, and Kali rode with Mia on the second horse. They did not ride straight into the gorge, but kept between its upper side and the forest. The new jungle had grown considerably during this last night of rain, but the ground under the new grass was black and still bore traces of fire. It was easy to surmise that either Smain had passed that way with his men, or that a fire caused by lightning had swept over the dried jungle, and having at last struck the wet forest, had wound itself through the rather narrow course between it and the ravine. Therefore Staś tried to see whether traces of Smain's encampment or imprints of his horse's hoofs could be found on this route, and to his great joy he was convinced that nothing of the kind was to be seen. Kali, who understood such things, insisted that the fire must have been driven there by the wind more than 10 days ago. "That proves," said Staś, "that Smain is already heaven knows where with his Mahdists, and that we cannot possibly fall into his hands." He and Nell now began to look at the vegetation with some curiosity, for they had never been in a tropical forest before. They rode along close to the edge, so as to be in the shade. The ground was damp and soft, and covered with dark green grass, moss, and ferns. Here and there lay old rotten tree trunks covered with a carpet of beautiful orchids, with cups colored like variegated butterflies in the center of their buds. Wherever the sun shone, the earth glittered with other strange tiny orchids, whose 2 petals, rising from a 3rd petal, remind one of the head of a small animal with pointed ears. In many places the forest consisted of the shrubs of wild jasmine, forming garlands of thin, pink-colored tendrils. The wet paths and crevices were covered with ferns, forming an impenetrable thicket. This underbrush was low in some places, broad in others, and sometimes it grew tall, and was encircled by a kind of safflower, which in that case reached to the lowest branches of the tree, giving an effect of fine green lace. In the interior of the woods there were different kinds of trees: date and bread trees, fan palms, sycamores, large varieties of groundsel, acacias. Trees with dark, shining, bright blood-red foliage grew close together, stem to stem, with branches and twigs from which yellow and purple flowers shot forth like torches. In many places the tree trunks were completely hidden, being covered from head to foot with creepers, which swayed from one branch to the other, forming the capital letters W and M, and resembling festoons, curtains, or portieres. India rubber lianas nearly smothered the trees with their thousands of tendrils, and turned them into pyramids clothed in white flowers. Small lianas wound themselves round the larger ones, and the jungle was in some places so thickly matted that it almost formed a barrier through which neither human being nor animal could penetrate. Only here and there, in places where elephants whose strength nothing can withstand had forced a passage, were there gaps in the thicket, which looked like deep, winding corridors. The song of the birds, which make the European forests so charming, was absolutely lacking. On the other hand, there came from the tops of the trees the most peculiar sounds, resembling at times the sharp scraping of a saw, the hollow beating of pots and pans, the chattering of storks, the squeaking of an old rusty door, the clapping of hands, the mewing of cats, and even the loud and animated conversation of human beings. From time to time, a swarm of gray, green, or white parrots, or a multitude of colored pepper-eaters, with their gliding, wave-like motion, swung themselves in the trees. On the snow-white background of the India rubber vines, there sometimes crept like forest spirits little monkeys in mourning, perfectly black, with the exception of their white tails, white stripes on their sides, and strange-looking white whiskers encasing their coal-black faces. The children gazed with admiration and surprise at the forest, which the eyes of a white man had perhaps never seen before. Saba constantly ran under the bushes and barked cheerfully. Little Nell felt strengthened by the quinine, her breakfast, and her sleep. Her little face was fresh and somewhat rosy, and her eyes had a happier expression. Every minute she asked Staś the names of the various trees and birds, and he answered her as best he could. At last she said that she would like to get off the horse and pick quantities of flowers. But the boy smiled and said, "The Caiaphas would eat you up in a minute." "What's that? Caiaphas? Is that something worse than a lion?" "Worse and still not worse. They are ants that bite fearfully. The branches are covered with them, and they fall like a shower of fire from the trees and alight on one's back. They crawl along the ground, too. If you should try to get off your horse and go into the woods, you would soon begin to hop about and scream like a little monkey. One might more easily protect oneself from a lion. Sometimes they come in large swarms, and then everything gives way before them. But you could surely prevent them doing you any harm." "I? Why, certainly I could." "How? With fire or boiling water?" "You always know how to defend yourself," she said, thoroughly convinced. Staś felt very much flattered at these words, and so answered in a cheerful voice, "If you only keep well, you can rely on me for the rest. I have not even a headache now. Thank heaven, thank heaven." During this conversation they were riding on the border of the forest, which was only divided from the narrow pass by a hedge. The sun was still high in the heavens, and its scorching rays beat down on them, for the weather was fine, and there was not a cloud above the horizon. The horses were sweating profusely, and Nell began to complain of the heat. And so Staś, seeing a suitable place, turned into the gorge, the west side of which was now completely shady. The water still left in the hollows after the storm of the previous day was now fairly cold. Over the heads of the little wanderers there continually flew, from one side of the gorge to the other, pepper-eaters with purple heads, blue breasts, and yellow wings, and the boy began to tell Nell what he had read in books about their habits. "You know," he said, "there are pepper-eaters which, in the brooding season, find a cavity in a tree, and the female then carries the eggs there and sets on them, and the male closes the opening with clay so that only the head of the female is visible, and not until the young ones are hatched does he break the wall of clay with his large beak and give the female her liberty again. And what does she have to eat all this time? The male feeds her. He flies about constantly and brings her various kinds of berries." "And is she allowed to sleep?" asked Nell in a sleepy voice. Staś smiled. "If Mrs. Pepper-Eater is as sleepy as you are, then the male permits her to go to sleep." In the coolness of the gorge, the girl was suddenly overcome by drowsiness, for her nap that morning had been too short, and she needed more sleep. In fact, Staś really had a great mind to follow her example, but could not, because he had to hold fast to her for fear she might fall. And besides, he was very uncomfortably seated, riding astride on the broad, flat saddle which Hatim and Seki Tamala had made in Fashoda for the little girl. He hardly dared move, and he guided the horse as slowly as possible so as not to wake her up, and she leaned back, laid her small head on his shoulder, and fell sound asleep. But she breathed so quietly and evenly that Staś did not regret having given her the last small quinine powder. On hearing her deep breathing, he felt that for the present the danger of fever was over, and he began to make the following observations. The bed of the gorge leads continually uphill, and just at this particular spot it is rather steep. We have climbed higher and higher, and the ground is much drier than below. We must now search for a high and well-sheltered place near a rapid stream, and settle down there, give the little one a few weeks in which to recover, and perhaps we shall be obliged to wait until the Masika is over. Few girls would have borne up under a 10th part of these trials, and she must take a good rest. After a night such as we have passed through, any other girl would have come right down with the fever. But she, how soundly she sleeps! Thank God! These thoughts encouraged him, but though he spoke cheerfully to himself while gazing on Nell's head reposing on his shoulder, he was also surprised at his emotions. It really is strange how fond I am of this little one. I have always been fond of her, but now I care more and more. And as he did not know how to account for this, he reflected as follows. This is probably due to the fact that we have undergone so many dangers together, and also because she happens to be in my care. While meditating thus, he held the child very carefully with his right hand in her belt so that she could not fall out of the saddle. They rode on slowly and silently, and Kali whispered in Stash's ear these flattering words. The great man kills Gabur, kills lion and buffalo. Ya! Ya! The great man will kill many lions. Plenty of meat! Plenty of meat! Ya! Ya! Kali, asked Stash softly, do the Wahimas hunt lions too? Wahima afraid of lions, but Wahima dig deep trenches, and if a lion falls into them during the night, why then Wahima laughs. What would you do then? Wahima throw many spears until the lion like a porcupine, then drag him out of the trench and eat him. Lion good. And as was his custom, he stroked his stomach. This way of killing lions did not appeal strongly to Stash, so he began to question Kali as to what other kind of game was to be found in the land of the Wahima. And so they talked more about antelopes, ostriches, giraffes, and rhinoceroses, until they heard the splashing of a waterfall. What's that? Cried Stash. In front of us is a stream and a waterfall, too. Kali nodded his head as a sign that it was really so. For a time they rode on, quickening their pace and listening intently to the rushing of the water, which was heard more distinctly every minute. A waterfall, repeated Stash, who was much interested, but they had scarcely passed through one or two bends in the gorge when they suddenly perceived an insurmountable obstacle lying across their path. Nell, who had been lulled to sleep by the regular motion of the horse, awoke at once. Are we stopping to put up here for the night? She asked. No, but look, answered Stash. See, a rock is lying across the gorge. What can we do? It is impossible to creep alongside of the rock, for it is very narrow just here, and so we must turn back a little way and try to climb to the top and go around it. But as there are still 2 hours before nightfall, we have plenty of time, and this will give the horses a chance to get their wind. Do you hear the waterfall? I hear it. That's where we'll halt for the night. He then turned to Kali and ordered him to climb up the side of the narrow pass to see whether the bottom of the gorge was blocked with more obstacles. As for Stash, he began to inspect the rock very carefully, and after a while he exclaimed, It must have broken off and fallen down here very recently. Do you see where it has broken off, Nell? See how fresh the break is. There is not even moss or in fact any other kind of plant to be seen on it. I understand now. I understand! And with his hand he pointed to a baobab tree growing on the side of the ravine, its enormous roots hanging down over the side of the cliff where the rock had broken off. This root has forced its way through a crevice between the wall and the rock, and has grown so long and so thick that it has split the rock off. That seems strange, for stone is harder than wood, but I do know that such things happen in the mountains. A rock like this, which has scarcely any hold, breaks off at the least jar. But what could have jarred it so? That's difficult to say. Perhaps a previous storm, perhaps yesterday's rain. Saba had remained behind the caravan, but now he came running up, as if someone were pulling him back by the tail, sniffed, squeezed himself through the small passage between the hedge and the fallen rock, and then immediately began to back out, his hair standing on end. Stash dismounted to see what had frightened the dog. Stash, don't go, begged Nell. Perhaps there is a lion there. But the boy, who loved to boast of his wonderful deeds, and who since the events of the day before had been greatly enraged against lions, answered, That's great, a lion by day. But before he had time to approach the passage, Kali's voice was heard from above the gorge. Bwana kubwa! Bwana kubwa! What's the matter? Cried Stash. In a moment the Negro slid down the stalk of a creeper. It could easily be seen from his face that he was the bearer of some great news. An elephant! He exclaimed. An elephant! Yes, answered the young Negro, gesticulating with his hands. Over there rushing water and here cliffs. Elephant cannot get out. The great man kill elephant and Kali eat him. Oh, eat! Eat! This thought made him so happy that he began to jump around, to smack his lips and slap his knees, and to laugh like an idiot, at the same time rolling his eyes and showing his white teeth. Stash did not understand at first why Kali said that the elephant could not escape from the gorge, so to make sure of what had happened he mounted his horse, and giving Nell into Mia's care, so that he could have both hands free in case it were necessary to shoot, he ordered Kali to mount behind him. Then they all turned back and began to look for a place where they could climb up. On the way, Stash asked how the elephant could have got in there, and from Kali's answer, he surmised what had really happened. Apparently the elephant had sought refuge from the flames during the forest fire, and on his way knocked against the rock, which, being insecure, had fallen down and cut off all means of his return. On running further, he had come to the end of the narrow pass and found himself on the edge of the abyss through which the stream flowed, and was thus hemmed in. After a short time they discovered a way out of the gorge, but as it was rather steep, it was necessary to dismount and lead the horses. As the Negro assured them that the stream was not far off, they continued to walk on until they reached the top. At last they came to a high strip of land, which was bordered on the one side by the stream and on the other by the ravine, and then looking down into the depth, they saw the elephant on the flat ground. The huge animal lay on its stomach, and Staś was very much astonished that he did not jump up when he caught sight of them, for, as Saba made a dash for the edge of the narrow pass and began to bark, the beast only moved his enormous ears once, and raising his trunk, immediately let it fall again. The children held each other's hands tight and looked at him a long while in silence, until Kali said, "He hunger, die." In fact, the elephant had become so thin that the whole length of his backbone stood out like a comb. His sides were hollow, and beneath his hide, notwithstanding its thickness, his ribs could be plainly seen, and it was easy to conjecture that the reason he did not get up was because his strength was exhausted. The gorge, fairly broad at the entrance, changed into a small pocket, closed in on both sides by perpendicular cliffs, at the bottom of which grew a few trees. These trees had been broken off, their bark was torn off, and not a leaf remained. Nearly all the vines that had overhung the cliffs had been eaten, and the grass throughout the entire pocket had been uprooted and eaten, even to the very last blade. After Staś had taken in the whole situation, he began to narrate to Nell what he had seen. But as he thought that the huge animal was doomed to die, he spoke very softly, as if afraid of darkening the last hours of his life. "Yes, he is really dying of hunger. Probably he has been a prisoner here for the last 2 weeks, since the time when the forest fire burned up the old jungle. He has eaten up everything that was eatable, and now he's being slowly tormented to death, for he can see breadfruit trees and acacias growing above him, but is unable to reach them." And once more they looked down in silence for a while at the elephant, who every now and then turned his small, dying eyes toward them, and each time a sound like a sob escaped from his throat. "Really," the boy said, "it would be a mercy to put an end to his suffering." At these words he raised the rifle to his shoulder, but Nell caught him by the coat, and standing right in front of him, used all her force to drag him away from the edge of the ravine. "Staś! Don't do it! Give him something to eat. He is so thin. I will not let you shoot him. I will not. I will not." And stamping still more emphatically with her foot, she continued to pull him away. He looked at her in surprise, but on seeing tears in her eyes, said, "But Nell, I will not allow it. I will not let him be killed. If you kill him, I shall get the fever." This threat sufficed to make Staś abandon his murderous intentions in regard to this elephant and others as well. In fact, he remained silent for a while, as he did not know what to answer the child. Then he said, "Well, all right, I tell you, it is all right. Nell, let me go." And Nell at once embraced him, and a smile shone out of her tear-stained little eyes. Her only care now was to give the elephant some food as soon as possible. Kali and Mia were very much surprised on hearing that Bwana Kubwa was not only not going to shoot the elephant, but that they must straightway pick the fruit of the bread tree, the pods of the acacia, and various herbs, leaves, and grass, as much as they could collect. Geber's double-bladed Sudanese sword greatly aided Kali in accomplishing this task, for without it the work would have been by no means easy. But Nell did not want to wait until they had finished, and as soon as the first fruit fell from the breadfruit tree, she grasped it with both hands, carried it to the gorge, and repeated quickly to herself, as if afraid that anyone else should get there first, "I." But Staś had no thought of depriving her of this pleasure. On the contrary, he took hold of her belt, for fear that in her great excitement she might fall over the edge of the cliff together with her breadfruit, and cried, "Throw it down!" The enormous fruit rolled over the steep precipice and fell at the feet of the elephant, who immediately put out his trunk, picked it up and crunched it as if eager to swallow it at once, and it disappeared instantly. "He has eaten it up!" cried Nell, overjoyed. "I should say so," answered Stash, laughingly. The elephant now put out his trunk toward them, as if asking for more, and then could be heard his "Hrumph! He wants more yet?" "I should think he did," replied Stash. A second fruit now disappeared like the first, followed by a third, fourth, 10th. Then in rapid succession he ate acacia pods, big bundles of grass, and various kinds of leaves. Nell would not permit anyone to replace her, and when at last her little hands became tired, she still pushed more food down to him with her feet. The elephant continued eating, and it was only now and then between mouthfuls that he raised his trunk and gave forth a thundering hrumph to denote that he wanted more, and as Nell felt certain, to show his gratitude. At last, Kali and Mia got tired of this work, which they had performed very faithfully, and they silently hoped that Bwana Kubwa would fatten the elephant and kill him later. At last, Bwana Kubwa told them to stop, for the sun had now sunk quite low, and it was time to begin the construction of the hedge. Luckily, it was not very difficult, for 2 sides of the 3-cornered strips of land were inaccessible, so that only the third one needed to be fenced in, and plenty of acacias with their terrible thorns grew nearby. Nell did not move an inch from the gorge, and crouching on its edge, with her legs tightly crossed, she informed Stash, who was some distance away, what the elephant was doing, and her thin little voice continually rang out, "He is feeling around with his trunk, or he is moving his ears. He has enormous ears." Then at last, "Stash! Stash! He is getting up! Oh!" Stash approached quickly and took Nell by the hand. In truth, the elephant had really gotten up, and only now could the children see his enormous size. They had occasionally seen large elephants being taken in ships through the Suez Canal on their way from India to Europe, but not one of them could compare with this colossus in size, for he really looked like a large slate-colored 4-footed rock. He differed from those they had seen in having enormous tusks 5 feet or more long, and, as Nell had already said, fabulously large ears. His front legs were very long, but comparatively thin, which was probably due to his having fasted so many days. "Oh, what a Lilliputian!" cried Stash. If he were to take a good stretch and throw out his trunk to its full length, he could catch hold of your little foot. But the giant neither thought of stretching himself, nor of catching anyone by the foot. With uncertain steps he advanced toward the entrance to the gorge, and looked for a while down into the ravine, at the bottom of which the waters whirled. Then he turned toward the side nearest the waterfall, sat down on his stomach, put out his trunk into the water, dipped it down deep, and began to drink. It was lucky for him, said Stash, that he could reach down into the water with his trunk. Otherwise, he would have died. The elephant drank so long that the girl became alarmed. "Stash, will he not harm himself?" said she. "I don't know," he answered smilingly, "but as you have taken him under your special care, you should warn him now." And so Nell bent over the side and called, "Enough, dear elephant, enough!" And the dear elephant, as if he understood what was meant, immediately stopped drinking, and at once began to spray himself with the water, first his legs, then his back, and lastly his 2 sides. In the meanwhile it began to get dark, and so Stash guided the little girl back to the hedge, where supper was already awaiting them. Both children were in the best of humor, Nell because she had saved the elephant's life, and Stash because he saw her small eyes gleaming like stars, and her happy little face looking fresher and healthier than it had since their departure from Khartoum. What also added to the satisfaction of the boy was that he had promised himself a quiet and good night's rest. The strip of land, inaccessible on 2 sides, ensured them from attack from those directions, and on the 3rd side, Kali and Mia had erected such a high hedge out of prickly acacias and branches of passiflora that there was no possibility of any beast of prey being able to break through the barrier. Besides, the weather was fine, and soon after sunset the sky was studded with stars. It was very pleasant to be cooled off by being in the proximity of the waterfall, and to breathe the heavy fragrance of the jungle and the freshly broken-off branches. "The fly will not get the fever here," thought Stash joyfully. They began to talk about the elephant, for Nell could speak of nothing else, and she continually expressed her admiration for his huge size, his trunk, and his tusks, which really were enormous. At last she said, "How wise he is, Stash, isn't he?" "As wise as Solomon," replied Stash. "But how did you find that out?" "Because when I asked him to stop drinking, he immediately complied with my request." If he had never taken lessons in the English language before, and understands what you said to him, then indeed it is quite remarkable. Nell perceived that Stash was making fun of her, so she fondled him like a little kitten, and said, "Say what you like, but I'm certain that he is very wise, and that he can be readily tamed at once." "Whether readily and at once, I'm not sure, but he can be tamed. The African elephant is wilder than the Asiatic, but I believe that Hannibal, for instance, used African beasts." Who was Hannibal? Stash looked indulgently and pityingly at her. "Of course," he said, "at your age you are not expected to know. Hannibal was a great leader of the Carthaginian army, which used elephants in the war with the Romans, and as Carthage was in Africa, he was obliged to use African elephants." The conversation was interrupted by a tremendous trumpeting of the elephant, which, after having satisfied his hunger and thirst, began, either from joy or longing to be free, to signal with his trunk. Saba sat up and began to bark, and Stash said, "See what you have done. Now he is calling his friends. A nice story if a whole herd were to approach." "He will tell the others that we were good to him," answered Nell hastily. But Stash, who really was not at all worried, because he reckoned that, even if several were to come along, the light of the fire would frighten them away, laughed defiantly and said, "Well, well, but if elephants should appear, you will not cry for fear. Oh, no, your eyes would only perspire as they have done twice before." And he began to imitate her. "I'm not crying, only my eyes perspire so." When Nell saw that he was joking, she concluded that they were in no danger. "If we tame him," she said, "then my eyes will not perspire any more, even if 10 lions should roar." "Why?" "Because he will protect us." Stash quieted Saba, who had continued to bark in answer to the elephant's trumpeting, then thought a while and continued, "But, Nell, there is one thing that you did not think of. We shall not stay here forever. We must ride on further. I do not say immediately. On the contrary, this place is very convenient and healthy, so I have decided to remain here 1 week, perhaps 2, for you and I, and in fact all of us need a good rest." "Well, all right. As long as we stay here we will feed the elephant, although this is an enormous task for us all. He is imprisoned, and we cannot take him with us. But how will this end? We shall go away and he will stay here and starve once more until he succumbs, and of course we will grieve even more than we would now." Nell felt very sad, and for a time sat there silently, apparently not knowing what answer to make to these very sensible remarks. But soon she raised her head, and pushing aside the lock of hair which always fell over her forehead into her eyes, she turned her eyes confidently toward the boy. "I know," she said, "that you could get him out of the gorge if you only wanted to." "Yes," but she put out a finger, touched Stash's hand, and repeated, "Yes, yes, yes!" The small and clever little lady knew quite well that the boy would be flattered by her confidence in him, and that from now on he would earnestly consider how to release the elephant.
Remember to subscribe.